That's been longer than a second. Okay. Well, welcome to the Pat Conroy Literary Center and our new digs. It's our first in-person event of 2021. And all of you are probably like me that at one point, the beginning of 2020, I wondered if we would ever have in-person events again. It was so scary, but you know, here we are. And thank all of you for coming. I'm always so touched to be with a bunch of book lovers and readers, because so many other things you can be doing, and you know, the bottom's about to fall out and all this. If you're a writer, it's the first thing you think of when you go somewhere. Oh, well, rain, there goes my crowd, you know. So thank each and every one of you for coming. Be sure and look around our new facility. We are quite proud of it. And I think rightfully so. We're really happy to be here and happy to have this event. And I'm particularly happy to be asked to introduce my good friend, Susan Cushman from Memphis. And I want to tell you just a little bit about Susan. Susan, I can't even remember how many years ago we met and became friends.
I'll talk about that part.
Okay. Maybe I should have kept that to myself. Yeah, but I know Susan sent me her first novel to read, and I read this and I thought, whoa, this is amazing book. And so I'm always interested in anything that takes a different look at, you know, top and does it in a different approach and so forth. And I think you've done that in a lot of your writings. So she has a memoir out about her mother's struggle with Alzheimer's and her as a caregiver, which if any of you, hope not, but if any of you are, you know, facing that or know someone that is, I found things like that very helpful when I've been in, you know, personal struggles myself, especially as a caretaker. And 3 anthologies, and putting together, as Jonathan can tell you, an anthology is a lot more work than you might think. You might think all you have to do is just ask people, and when it gets together, you send it off to the publisher. But there's a lot more to it than that. So, and I have, every time she's asked me to contribute to one of her anthologies, I've done so. So Susan's a professional writer. She has directed conferences, you know, nationwide conferences at Ole Miss and so forth, and has all sorts of goodies on her resume. But I want to tell you about this book. This is not it. I'm talking about her book before that she's taught me, and I'll tell you why. This is a story within a story, and kind of within a story even at that. I said a long time ago, maybe even back when I first started writing, and the way I love libraries, you know, somebody needs to write more books set in libraries and or about libraries, because there's just so many of us that it means so much to us. When I heard that Susan was doing a book based on her own personal experience of a writer who goes around to set in Mississippi to do readings at all of the libraries. She's called it Friends of the Library. I was just so excited about this, and I have to tell you, Susan, this is pretty fun. When I picked up my book at home, I looked at it and I thought, boy, somebody said something really nice on the front of it too. I thought it was one of the many praises that you had for the book, and it was me. But I meant every word. But what I loved about it is it's such a perfect setup for a book. It's almost like a book of short stories, in that there are all these stories. She meets all these different people, and you know, they come together in different ways in each of the library. So what she did with one of these in the book that she's going to be talking to us tonight is that she has a little, almost a teaser of a story in here about a couple who, a biracial couple that she met at the library, and then wanting to know their story. And from that story, just as, like I said, there's just a little bit of it in here, but from that story, I think, Susan, you told me that so many people had really liked their story and wanted to hear more about it, that came this book, John and Mary, or is it Mary, Margaret, and John? John and Mary, Margaret?
Yes.
John comes first, okay. So it's a wonderful book, and it's such a great idea, and I'm just so excited for you to tell us more about him. Especially interested, I just have to throw this in real quickly, in that it's set in Mississippi and Ole Miss mostly, and I was actually witness to a race riot in 1963 on the campus of Ole Miss. I don't know if I've ever even told you that, at the Southern Literary Festival. They burned a car and all this stuff because the festival was integrated. So this spoke to me in more ways than I can tell you. So Susan, tell us about your new book. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Now I have to start off doing something really cheesy. Hey y'all. I have to prove there were people here. So thank you so much, Cassandra. Cassandra, like Pat, doesn't know how to say no. And, he was called a blurb. Can I say the word? A blurb slut. He called himself that. And Cassandra has blurbed several of my books and contributed essays to 3 anthologies I edited. And I was so thrilled when she was willing to introduce me tonight. We met in 2006 at the Southern Festival of Books, back when it used to be in Memphis every other year and Nashville every other year. Now it's always in Nashville. But this was the last time it was in Memphis. And you were there for The Sunday Wife. And I fell in love with that book. And I identified with a lot of things in it. And Cassandra wrote in the inside of my copy to Susan, who knows what a Sunday wife is. And I knew we'd always be friends. So thank you so much for that. And thanks to Jonathan and everyone at the Pat Conroy Literary Center. And I love the new digs. I'm glad there's room to have events. That makes it wonderful. The last time I was here, you were still in the other location. And so it was a lot smaller. So anyway, my talk tonight, I've actually given it a title. I don't think I've ever done that before. I have my 2 new favorite words as a writer. What if? So what if, well, I'm gonna start my back up before I actually say what if. For years, I tried to write a memoir about things early in my life, up into young adulthood. And it included childhood sexual abuse, years in a cult-like religious group, some other things like that. And I decided after writing it, which was very cathartic, that I didn't want to go public with some of the details. So I tried to, you don't just take a memoir and change the names and call it a novel. That's not, they're 2 different art forms. So, you need to really write a whole new story and just let those experiences inform the story. So that's what I did with Cherry Bomb, my first novel that Cassandra also blurbed. And I started out by asking myself, what if? What if a little girl escapes from a religious cult and throws up graffiti as a cry for help? What if she gets a scholarship to study at the Savannah College of Art and Design? What if she's mentored by a famous abstract expressionist artist, Elaine de Kooning? What if she's introduced to iconography and visits a monastery to take a workshop? What if there turns out to be a relationship between the girl, the artist, and a nun at the monastery? What if their lives and their relationships are touched and healed by a weeping icon? I answered all of those questions in my novel Cherry Bomb, which was published in 2017. My publisher for that book was from a small town in Mississippi, and he asked me to go on the book tour, as Cassandra mentioned, to 10 small towns in Mississippi to speak to their friends of the library groups. And at first I was kind of grumbled about it. I'm like, drive all over Mississippi. I live in Memphis. Some of these towns were not very close. There'll probably be 3 people there. They're going to be old. They're not going to buy books. That was my attitude. And he said, just go. And so I said, okay. And so before I visited each town, I researched the town. And even though I'm from Mississippi, I grew up in Jackson, I had never been to a lot of these small towns, Eupora, Pontotoc, West Point, Senatobia. And so I researched them, and I began to fall in love with each one. And as I drove into each one, I mapped where to go visit this famous antebellum home, this famous blues place, this famous cultural sites all over my home state. It was an incredible blessing. And I'm a big blogger. I've had a blog for over a decade. And usually I write about everything that happens in my life, my husband, to his chagrin. But as I came home from each of these events, instead of writing a blog post, I had an idea. Why don't I write short stories instead? And that way I can make stuff up, And so I created Adele Covington, and she's the fictional author who goes through all the towns. So I asked myself, what if a fictional author visits those towns and becomes involved in the lives of some of the wounded people she meets at their Friends of the Library meetings? What if this author falls in love with each town, with its history, its beautiful historical buildings, and the famous people who once lived there? Because I love to do cameos. Like, who knew that in Pontotoc, Mississippi, Jim Weatherly was from there, who wrote Midnight Train to Georgia. So he has a cameo appearance in the short story that's set there. And it just makes the stories especially more real to people who either know him or know the area. What if she uses her own experiences to help her fictional characters who are dealing with issues like Alzheimer's, cancer, sexual abuse, adoption, alcoholism, and homelessness? So those were some of the issues that I dealt with in those short stories, and all of those have touched my life in one way or another. And they became Friends of the Library, published in 2019. Then along came 2020 and the pandemic, and like a lot of people, I got in a real funk at first. Like 2 months, I ate junk food and watched TV. And gained at least a COVID-19, And then finally, my husband said, you're a writer. And when you're so busy going places all the time, you're always saying, I need more time to write. Well, duh, you're stuck at home. So, it's a good time to write. And and several readers who had read the short story said, why don't you turn the short story about John and Mary Margaret into a novel? So I thought, what if? And that's how John and Mary Margaret was born. I think what I'll do is read an excerpt, the author's note in the back of the book. You might even want to read it first. I don't think it really has spoilers in it, but it tells you more about why the book was written. I'll read a little excerpt from it, starting with, I love quotes. There are a lot of quotes in here. This one's from Eudora Welty. Every writer, like everybody else, thinks he's living through the crisis of the ages. To write honestly and with all our powers is the least we can do, and the most. Well, I wrote this book while isolated during COVID-19 virus pandemic in the spring and summer of 2020. And yes, I thought I was living through the crisis of the ages. And maybe I was. Maybe we still are. Parallel to the health crisis was the growing unrest in our country as protests erupted nationwide in response to the killing of unarmed Black men by white police officers. The inequality and mistreatment of Blacks started in the 1500s. And y'all know this. This is when the first African slaves were brought to what would become South Carolina. 500 years later, the descendants of those slaves who were legally freed in 1862 are still fighting for justice and equality. I was born in Jackson, Mississippi in 1951 and came of age in the 60s Jim Crow South. I graduated from high school in 69 with less than a dozen African-American students in our school of over 1,200. The following year, busing would change the landscape of our historically segregated education system in Jackson and other parts of the South forever. And I would also like to say that part of why I wrote this book is that I have 2 adopted Korean children, 1 Black son-in-law, 1 Hmong daughter-in-law, and 4 mixed race granddaughters. So, their lives are very much on my heart. And in the front of the book, I dedicated it to my granddaughters, Grace, Anna, Gabby, and Izzy. May the world embrace you with love and kindness. because I don't know what's going to be in store for them, and for their lives. John and Mary Margaret is a rare insider's look into the white privilege bubble. Might get tired of those words, but I can't think of anything better that describes what my life was like. Of a young girl growing up in Jackson, Mississippi, participating in sorority life on the Ole Miss campus in the late 1960s. But it's also a portrayal of a young Black boy from Memphis who follows his dream to study law at the predominantly white university. So again, I had to ask myself, what if? What if their shared love for literature blossoms into an ill-fated romance? Because John and Mary Margaret meet in English class, and they especially love William Faulkner. So they're studying for their Faulkner exam together. What if I keep the fictional author of Adele, who traveled through the small towns in Friends of the Library, what if I keep her on as a role of a reliable observer narrator in this book, using her as a fictional device by which John and Mary Margaret share their stories with the reader? As the book opens, Adele speaks to their book club in Harbortown, the new urban neighborhood on the Mississippi River in downtown Memphis, where I actually live. She meets with John and Mary Margaret after the book club meeting, and they begin to tell her their stories, which start back in the 1950s in Memphis for John and in Jackson, Mississippi for Mary Margaret. What if 14-year-old Mary Margaret has a chance meeting with the famous Southern author Eudora Welty in the summer of 1963, who lives in her neighborhood in Jackson, Mississippi, where I lived in the 1970s, although I never met Miss Welty. So I'm going to read an excerpt from that event. This may be my favorite part of the book. She wanted to be a writer. Maybe it started in junior high when she had a story published in her school's literary journal. By 10th grade, she was already a feature writer for the high school newspaper, where she would end up with the editor's job her senior year. She even traveled to Chicago on a train to a National High School Journalism Conference that year. While many of her best friends were busy on the cheerleading squad or the drill team, Mary Margaret spent most of her free time reading. It's not that she wasn't pretty enough to be a cheerleader. She was one of the most beautiful girls in the school, with her silky golden hair, sky blue eyes, and perfect figure. But she loved books, and she especially loved Southern literature, and had been over the moon excited when she struck up a friendship in the summer of 1963 with one of Mississippi's most famous authors, her neighbor, Eudora Welty. Miss Welty's house was only a few blocks from the Sutherlands, that was her last name, in the historic Bellhaven neighborhood. But her first and completely serendipitous meeting with Miss Welty happened a few blocks away at the neighborhood jitney jungle. Miss Welty was struggling with a bag of groceries as she dug around in her pocketbook for her car keys when Mary Margaret approached her in the grocery store parking lot. "May I help you?" "Oh, yes, please. I should have gotten my keys out of my pocketbook before leaving the store. Can you hold this bag for me?" Taking the sack of groceries from Miss Welty's hand, Mary Margaret couldn't believe her luck. Of course, all the kids in the neighborhood knew who she was. She was known as the Popsicle Lady because she gave out popsicles to kids who came by her house during the steamy hot summers. But Mary Margaret always thought that was rude of other kids, so she didn't join them. Once she began to read Miss Welty's short stories in junior high, she was hooked. And now she was about to meet her in person, and it was like Christmas in July. "Would you like to come to my house for some sweet tea later?" Miss Welty asked as Mary Margaret placed the groceries in her car. "Oh my," she blushed, "I would love to, but I wouldn't want to interrupt your work." Miss Welty laughed. "Oh goodness, honey, I never get any writing done in the afternoon. The morning hours are best, when the subconscious is still alive with dreams and the brain is most open to creativity. In fact, you could just ride home with me now if you'd like. Unless you need to be somewhere. Are you shopping for your mother?" "Oh no, I was just getting a snack. Mom does the grocery shopping for our family. I would love to join you." "Do you live in Bellhaven?" "Oh yes, ma'am. I'm Mary Margaret Sutherland. My family lives on Arlington." Mary Margaret couldn't believe she was riding in the car with Eudora Welty and following her inside her home, although it was only a few blocks from her own. And once inside the house, she was even more awestruck. And I have to say, I felt the same way. It's been turned into a museum, her house has. And the first time I walked through it, I felt the same way. There's a typewriter, there's her stacks of papers. And I mean, it's like being in the Pat Conroy Literary Center. So go on out on the porch and have a seat while I put these groceries away. I'll bring us some tea in a minute. Should she follow her in the kitchen and offer to help? Or would that be too intrusive? Instead, she took a few minutes to peek into a room with a desk and typewriter, stacks of books and paper everywhere. Was she in the inner sanctum of this world-famous writer? Maybe her talent would rub off on Mary Margaret. Back out on the porch, she sat on a small love seat and found herself on the receiving end of some cold, sweet iced tea, served in a tall, thin crystal glass. As Miss Welty took her seat on a nearby chair, Mary Margaret's mind raced, flooded with questions. Before she could begin, Miss Welty picked up a copy of the New Yorker magazine off a nearby wicker table and handed it to her. Have you seen this yet? It was dated July 6, 1963. Just a week earlier. Mary Margaret took the magazine and said, "No, ma'am. In fact, I don't believe I've ever seen this magazine at all." "What's it about?" "Well, how old are you, child?" "I'm 14, just finished 9th grade." "Well, I don't imagine you have read the New Yorker. Have you seen it around your house? Perhaps your parents read it." Mary Margaret shook her head, looking somewhat embarrassed for herself and her parents. "Should they have?" Miss Welty laughed. "Well, I guess that depends a bit on their political leanings. Did they vote for Nixon or Kennedy?" Nixon, I think. I don't really pay that much attention to politics. I'm more into literature, mainly fiction. I want to be a writer." Miss Welty smiled gently. "Well, young lady, it's time you learned that you can't learn about the world around you just by reading short stories and novels, or even by writing them. Where do you think writers get their ideas from?" Mary Margaret shrugged, sipped more of her tea, and wished that she could be the one asking the questions. Trying to sound more grown up, she asked, "Why did you show me this magazine? Do you have a short story published in it or something?" "Good question, and indeed I do." "Oh, good, I was hoping so." Mary Margaret was eager to get away from politics and on to discussing literature. She loved some of Welty's early stories, like Why I Live at the P.O. "Well," Miss Welty said as she poured some more tea, "my story in this magazine is called Where Is This Voice Coming From? And I wrote it because of what happened to Medgar Evers last month. You do know who Medgar Evers is, don't you?" "Oh, yes, ma'am. We saw that on the news. Terrible that he was shot." "Yes, it was. And I wrote a story about it the very night of the shooting. It's fiction, and it's from the point of view of the killer." "So you think what the killer did was right?" Mary Margaret was confused now. "Oh, no, dear, not at all. But I wanted to understand why he did it. What was he thinking? What moved him to do such an awful deed? If you want to be a writer, or at any rate a good one, you've got to get into your characters' heads, whether they are good or bad." Mary Margaret nodded. "Oh, can I borrow this so I can read the story?" Miss Welty smiled. "Of course. I've got more copies. Maybe your parents will even read it. Come back and visit another day and tell me what you think." "Yes, ma'am." Mary Margaret held the magazine close to her heart like it was a treasure. She wanted to say something intelligent sounding to show Miss Welty she wasn't some dumb kid, but maybe she was. There was so much going on in the world, especially in her hometown, that she didn't understand. I was so much like Mary Margaret, I'm a lot like her, and I'm also a lot like Adele, the author that they tell their stories to. So that's, again, where you can take things from your own life, and pour them into a novel. So I had to continue with the what ifs. So what if John and Mary Margaret, see, she's 14 there, so I'm jumping way ahead. She goes to Ole Miss, pledges tried out sorority like her mother was, and John goes to Ole Miss. And John's father didn't want him to go there. His father coached football at an all-black high school in Memphis, and his older brother was a football star and was going to a black college on a football scholarship. So this is what was expected of John. And he just cared about books and literature, but he also cared a lot about social justice, and he wanted to be a civil rights lawyer. And he wanted to go to Ole Miss. So against all odds, that's what he did. And they meet their freshman year. So what if John and Mary Margaret meet at her sorority house to study during the fall of their freshman year? I don't think I'll read that excerpt. I don't like to read to y'all too much. What if John takes Mary Margaret on a date to a football game? Which was fine, except that afterwards, what are they going to do when he takes her back to the Tridel's house? let me see, I'm skipping. Yeah, he takes her back to the Tridelt house. So I think I will read an excerpt about that. As John and Mary Margaret walked back towards the Tridelt house, he asked if she'd like to go somewhere to celebrate the football game they just won. Since there were no black fraternities on campus, they were a couple without a country on this typical game night at Ole Miss. Mary Margaret felt the loneliness of their predicament as her sorority sisters were all headed to parties with their dates. John had an old 1959 Chevrolet Bel Air parked in the lot by his dorm. So they walked over to his car, climbed into the front seat, and sat looking at each other expectantly. I guess we should have talked about what to do after the game, John offered. Well, it's not like I didn't think about it, Mary Margaret said, but I didn't want to bring it up. I didn't want to make you feel bad. After a minute of awkward silence, John said, "Do you like the blues?" Music? Oh, I guess that sounded stupid. I'm not sure. I mean, most of the music we have at parties on campus is rock and roll, Motown. Why are you asking? Well, there's a band called the Checkmates that plays at a club out on Old Sardis Road. Are you up for a different kind of cultural experience? You'll probably be the only white person there. Mary Margaret held her hand across her abdomen to calm the knot that seemed to be growing there. I guess so, but we have to be back by midnight for curfew at the house, of course. 45 minutes later, they pulled up into the gravel parking lot at Tom Charlie's. John got the door for Mary Margaret. As they entered the smoke-filled club, lead singer Henry Cook was just getting warmed up on stage, and the all-black audience was mingling at the bar and the small tables scattered between the bar and the stage. It was Mary Margaret's turn to be the focus of stares now, as all eyes were trained on her. John led her to a corner table on the far side of the bar, settled her into a chair before asking what she'd like to drink. "I'll have a Coke." "You sure that's all you want? They don't check IDs here." "Oh yeah, I'm sure." So John left her at the table and went to the bar to get their drinks. Mary Margaret played with a stray curl that had escaped her barrette and looked nervously around the club. Most of the couples that had stared as she and John walked in had gone back to watching the stage from their tables or moving rhythmically on the dance floor. John returned with their drinks and smiled as he watched Mary Margaret taking in the scene. "You're not in Kansas anymore," he said with a smile. She laughed. "Okay, I've never heard music like this before, but I like it. But I admit that it feels weird in here. How do you ever get used to being in the minority so much of your life?" "I don't get used to it. I'd like to be a part of changing the culture, but there's a lot of history behind the way things are, especially in the South." "You ever thought of moving away?" "Not really. I'd rather stay and make things better. That's why I want to go to law school and work as a civil rights lawyer in Memphis one day, or maybe even become a judge." "Wow, you're dreaming big." "Why do you say that? You mean because I'm Black?" "Okay, I can see how that sounded disrespectful, but what I meant was, it's a big goal for any college student, not just because of your race." "Well, what about your goals? With your love for Southern writers, are you going to become a writer yourself?" Mary Margaret laughed. "Well, that was my dream when I was younger. But Mother said I should be practical and major in education so I can get a job teaching school. Hopefully I'll get married and have kids." She blushed and looked away as she said that. "Of course, my folks want me to settle in Jackson, where I grew up." That all sounds so idyllic and safe. Mary Margaret let John's words settle in her mind as she sipped her Coke and listened to the blues floating through the room and into her heart. Several of the couples were slow dancing, their bodies moving as one to the sultry sounds coming from the band. John noticed her watching. "Want to dance?" That knot in her stomach returned, but she nodded as he took her hand and led her onto the dance floor. Henry Cook was singing "When a Man Loves a Woman," and several couples were making out on the dance floor. John held her close, and she closed her eyes, trying to think only of the two of them and not this unfamiliar place and people. As his cheek brushed hers, she felt a new sensation. Of course, she had slow danced with other boys, even been kissed by a few. Why did this feel so different? She wanted to believe it had nothing to do with how different they were. She had never been this close to a Black boy before. She found herself wishing he would move his hand lower on her back and pull her closer. She wanted to move in the sensual way she noticed the other couples in the room doing. His body seemed to sense her longing, and just when he was beginning to pull her closer, and they were getting lost in the music, an alarm sounded in her head. She pulled away suddenly and looked at her watch. It's 11 o'clock. We've got to go or I'll miss curfew. John reluctantly escorted her out the door. Just as the song ended, several couples were hanging out in the parking lot, smoking and talking. John smiled and nodded at them as they walked to his car. Mary Margaret felt guilty that their presence made her nervous. Once they were safely in John's car, she moved closer to him on the front seat. I'm really glad you brought me here, John. Their eyes found each other through the dim lights from the club, and John leaned toward her face. The kiss was unlike anything either of them had experienced before, at once tender but also very primal. She wanted more, but she didn't want to miss curfew at the house, so she moved reluctantly back across the seat, and John started the engine. So I'm not going to read what happened when he took her home and all the other couples were arriving back at the sorority house, but it wasn't a nice scene that happened. Some other scenes that happened. I did a lot of historical research, and so all of the historical scenes in here really did happen. Like John was part of the Black Student Union, and they stormed the Chancellor Fortune's house one night. That really happened. In February of 1970, I was a freshman there. There was a group called Up With People, and they were there for a concert. Some of y'all are nodding, yeah. And so this is really interesting because I read in my research that there was a big protest the night of the concert. 60 Black kids protested, marched up the aisle. Some of them went up on stage and grabbed the microphone, and it was a nonviolent protest. But as they heard sirens outside and saw blinking blue lights, they all left. 60 students were arrested. And so my husband and I went to that concert, and I read this and I said, how did we miss this? And I asked him if he remembered that happening, and he said no. I asked 4 sorority sisters who had read the book early to give me feedback. None of them remembered it happening. Finally, I found a person who knew what happened. The concert lasted 2 nights, and we all happened to go the night that there wasn't the protest. So, because it really did happen. And of those 60 people, 8 of them have been called the Ole Miss 8. And John is a mixture of 2 of those, one of whom came back to Ole Miss to teach and just retired recently, which is pretty incredible because they were expelled and were not allowed to get their degree. There's a character named Diana in here, and she had all her credits ready to get her diploma and was denied it. So in February of 2020, 50 years later, on the Ole Miss campus, they had a reunion for the Ole Miss 8, and she received her diploma 50 years later with a lot of apologies, from the university. So I'll put that in the epilogue at the back of the book. So I'll do one more really, really short excerpt because I know you get tired of being read to. But this just shows you Mary Margaret has another boyfriend, the rest of her time at Ole Miss, and which is not to be unexpected. And his name was Walker, and he was a Sigma Chi, and she was chosen as the sweetheart of Sigma Chi, which was a big deal on campus. So I'm going to read a short excerpt. My senior year, Mary Margaret was practice teaching at a local high school and begun dating a senior from Memphis named Walker Richardson. Walker was everything her mother wished for: tall, handsome, popular, with a secure future in his father's property development and management business. She was wearing his Sigma Chi pin and hoping for a ring before graduation. She was even chosen as the sweetheart of Sigma Chi, an honor envied by girls all over the campus. Walker and his fraternity brothers serenaded her outside the Tridelt house one night when he presented her with roses, and they sang the song, popular since 1913. The girl of my dreams is the sweetest girl of all the girls I know, and the moon still beams on the girl of my dreams. She's the sweetheart of Sigma Chi. With John and Mary Margaret seeming to go their separate ways after graduation, John staying at Ole Miss for law school, Mary Margaret going to Memphis to teach school, I continued to ask myself those 2 words. What if? What if John and Mary Margaret both end up in Memphis, married to other people, and finally meet again 35 years later when their spouses are in the same nursing home, suffering from Alzheimer's? What if? Well, what if I leave it to you to read the book and find out what happens after that? So, and I think I've already said the other things that influenced my writing was my family. So that's pretty much all about it. And I'm happy to have questions and a discussion. Comments or discussion? Yes.
So this is a real life couple.
No, they're
No.
completely fictional.
Okay, I didn't know if that was borrowed from one of your tours or.
No, they're
Okay.
completely fictional. Now, when I wrote about them from the short story in Friends of the Library, they were just fictional. They didn't, there was not a mixed race couple that showed up at that event. And someone asked me at a recent event, you know, what made me think to do that? And I don't know. I don't really have an answer. That was 2 years ago and it just happened. Yeah, I mean, one thing is I changed my writing mode. I used to be an outliner and I would plot and plan everything. So I knew, like my novel Cherry Bomb, I outlined 16 chapters and I knew what was going to happen all the way through, because people would say things like, oh, my characters just take on a life of their own. And I would think, that's nuts. They're not real. How can they do that? They're not real. So, but when I wrote the short stories for Friends of the Library, I decided to try that. And William Faulkner says he would do that. He would start with a character and or a setting, and then follow the characters and just try to keep up with them and write down what they do. So that's what I did with that group of short stories. And it's the most fun I have ever had writing. So that's what I did with John. Now with John and Mary Margaret, I already had a 20-page short story that was kind of like the synopsis for the novel. So there was no need to outline anyway. You know, I knew where it was going, but I was fleshing out different parts of it, going back to their childhoods and coming forward to 2020. It ends in 2020. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes.
So with apologies to Cassandra, you said you were going to tell us the story about how you
Oh, well, I think I did. In 2006, she was speaking about her novel, The Sunday Wife, in Memphis at the Southern Festival of Books. And I was in the audience. And I just, you know, my husband is an Orthodox priest. So he's a minister. He's also a physician. But I was kind of in the place of not wanting to fit the mode of a preacher's wife. And I don't fit that mode at all. And so Cassandra writes The Sunday Wife, and I'm going, yes, 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 I have to meet her, you know. And right away, I just felt a kindred spirit with her. And that's when she wrote to Susan, who knows what a Sunday wife is. Difference is, I didn't divorce my minister husband. We've been married next week 51 years. So, you know, we figured it out. We're very, very different, but I love him very, very much. So he's real supportive, but we're really different. Yeah. But I don't have to be a Sunday wife. Anybody else? Yes.
What's next?
What's next? I'm going to try. I'm going to write another novel. I've written maybe half of the first chapter, but it could get thrown away because I'm going to try this new method again. I'm not going to outline. I have the setting and the main characters in mind, and the setting is Seaside, Florida, which is my favorite place in the world. And we always go to Sea Grove right next door. It's where we stay for our vacations. But then we go into Seaside to do all the cool stuff. So it's going to be set in Seaside. The main characters are 4 women who've been best friends for decades, and they have a bridge club. And so the title is probably going to be the Seaside Bridge Club. But the kicker, the thing that's going to reappear, the what if, that's going to come back, that will now have been in my memoir, one of my short stories, and this novel is Alzheimer's. You know, my mother died from Alzheimer's, and her mother died from Alzheimer's. And I'm 3rd generation and can't remember every other word lately, it seems like. You know, so I'm going to use that again. I don't really know what's going to happen, and I can't wait to keep writing it with this new way of writing, of not knowing what's going to happen. I might have some ideas about it, but I'm not going to outline it and plot it out. So, yes.
I went to Faulkner's house once in Oxford.
Yes.
And I remember on the wall, he had like a whole outline.
Yeah, on the
You know what I'm
wall.
talking about?
Yeah.
So it seems like he must have outlined and improvised,
Yeah.
and especially reading his
Yeah.
stuff.
Well, he may have, but I think you can still be organized and yet still have the open mind to, as you're writing, quote, let your characters take on a life instead of going, this has to happen because I'm in control. You know, I think that's probably the difference, but you're right. That's really cool. I've seen that at his house there too, at Roanoke. Anybody else? Yes, Theodore.
In writing, do you follow Eudora Welty's advice and write early in the morning or any time of the day, or what schedule?
Yeah, I do like to write more in the morning, and I think she's right when she says that about the subconscious being more alive. You know, I used to write down my dreams and kind of do a little bit of Jungian, you know, thinking about them. But when I first get up in the morning is my best time to write, and by midday I'm done. You know, and I in the afternoons I would rather do other brain things. You know, like right now I'm on a book tour, and I've been doing marketing and traveling and speaking, and that's one side of the brain. Making up a new book is the other side of the brain. You know, so the afternoons work good for the busy, the marketing and all of that, and the mornings work good for the creative. For me, that's just the way it works. Hey. Now, anybody else? Somebody's here.
Who do you like to, who do you enjoy reading?
Do you ever heard of Pat Conroy? The Prince of Tides will forever be my favorite book. And of course, and Cassandra King. And both of they've been such mentors and supporters and inspirers. I also like, I'm not as big about reading older literature. I like more contemporary stuff. Jocelyn Jackson, I don't know if y'all read her work, and she has a lot of mystical and spiritual elements too. Now her more recent work has gotten a little edgier than mine. I loved The Hours by Michael Cunningham. I tried to read some more of his books. You know, usually you read a book by somebody and you go, oh, I'm gonna go read other things they've written. And sometimes that works, and sometimes you're not, you know, as big a fan that way. Patty Callahan Henry, I love her works, especially her more recent works, you know. Yeah. I read diversely too. I read a lot of memoirs about abuse and addiction and mental health issues. And all of that's probably because of my own struggles, but probably half of what I read is nonfiction. And then I am a convert to Eastern Orthodox Christian religion. And so I read a lot of spiritual things that are related to that. I studied iconography and painted icons, visited monasteries. And so a lot of that comes out in here too. So I read Orthodox Christian spiritual books and self-help and memoirs and then fiction. So, and I don't have a brand. You know, I write all genres except science fiction, maybe fantasy. I wouldn't know what to do with that. I wouldn't know how to build those worlds. That's different, a different talent. I'm impressed with people that can do it. Anybody else? Okay, Jonathan.
Susan, tell us your best Pulpwood Queens story.
I didn't even mention the Pulpwood Queens. So I went to do y'all know who the Pulpwood Queens are? Okay, I went to the first girlfriend weekend about 10 years ago. I think it was in 2010 with River Jordan. And I was not a published author yet. And River lives in Nashville and I live in Memphis. And she said, I'll pick you up and you'll just go. It'll be fun. I said, wow, what do people do? Oh, they dress up in costumes and there's a different theme every night. I said, dress up in costumes? How old are these people? Oh, older than you think, you know. And so I went and I thought, wow. And Pat Conroy was there serving the meal that night and buying all these newbies books and getting them to sign it. And that was when I fell in love with him in person. And so then I think all of my books except one have been Pulpwood Queen chosen books. So I've been on panels at about 5 of those girlfriend weekends, and all of them have been great fun, and I love the costumes and all the silly part too. It's a lot of fun. So I don't know if I have one story that's really crazy. I'm gonna disappoint you. You should have told me ahead of time. Or else maybe it shouldn't be told, you know. What happens?
Were you there when Pat took his britches off?
No, I missed that one. I heard about it. Yeah. Well, see, what happens at girlfriend
Fortunately, I
weekend
wasn't there.
stays. What happens at girlfriend weekend should stay at girlfriend weekend, right? Yeah, you weren't there the time I was there either. So
So now everybody wants to know why Pat took his pants off.
well, I don't know. mean, Cassandra would have to tell that story because
Jonathan, you tell it better.
somebody wanted it or something.
Seriously, because you used it in there.
Yes, I do, but I'm not on camera right now.
Oh.
Only Susan. has to.
Uh-oh, well, I think somebody wanted his pants, but I don't know.
Didn't we auction them off?
Auction them off.
I better.
I thought he used them to auction them off for a
Right, right.
fundraiser.
Or something. Oh, man.
And are those the same pants that are framed in?
They are in baskets.
Okay.
Okay, okay.
We see them tonight.
There you go. Well, y'all are a lot of fun. I was expecting a lot of heavy, serious questions, and these were more fun. So we better stop while we're ahead. Huh?
Well, how about one final question?
Okay, okay.
So you've taken one short story and turned it into a novel. Do you feel compelled to do that with any other story?
Yeah, I kind of do.
Yeah,
But,
I thought you might.
Yeah, I think I might. That my other favorite story in that collection is about a homeless man who comes to the Friends of the Library meeting, and he and Mary Margaret. Adele wants to hook him up with this woman who lives across the street from the library in a Victorian home, and it's all run down. She needs help taking care of the house, and he needs a place to live. So she's trying to hook him up, and the woman in the house went to school with Eudora Welty, and she herself wrote a book, and she's got a manuscript that's been in her attic for decades. So Adele's trying to get her to publish her book and to get the homeless man to move in with her, and he's an alcoholic, and so there's a whole lot there. And I might do that one because it'll be fun. But I think I'm better do this other novel first. I don't know. We'll see. Yes.
Can I ask a quick bonus question?
Oh yeah.
What you mentioned you were published first time 10 years ago?
No, it was in 2017.
Oh, 20. When did you start writing?
Junior high school, just like Mary Margaret in here. I wrote for the literary journal and then high school newspaper. And I thought I wanted to be a reporter or do journalistic writing. But then I got married when I was just turned 19, and I was a stay-at-home mom for a lot of years. And so I put off writing. So probably about 20 years ago, I started doing some freelance writing for magazines and that sort of thing. And then in 2001, so that's 20 years ago, my youngest child left for college. And I thought, now I'm going to do my thing. And first I painted icons, and then I started writing, and I love essays. So I had essays published in a number of anthologies and journals. And then my first book, I've had 7 books published in 5 years. So once I got busy, I decided to stay busy. You know, I'll have one project going, and then you have deadlines, and then you have nothing to do for weeks while you're waiting for the next deadline. So I had to have another project and another project. I couldn't write 2 novels at once, but you can be editing a novel and putting together an anthology at the same time. And I will say, when I put together the anthology about the girlfriends, the Public Queens that Jonathan helped me, I was editing, and there were 67 essays, just like there were in the Prince of Scribes. And so he helped me with the editing on that. But you know, organizing an anthology, even though it's work, to me it's a whole lot easier than writing a novel, because it's organizing, and I love to organize things. So I may do that again. My the second Blooming, Becoming the Women We're Meant to Be. My first anthology has essays by 20 women, and a forward by Anne Lamott. And then my second one, Southern Writers on Writing, has 26 essays, 13 men and 13 women writing about writing. And fortunately in that one, I met a wonderful African-American writer named Ralph Eubanks, and he helped me a lot with this book. He was an early reader for John and Mary Margaret and wrote a blurb. And he and I will be in a virtual conversation on July 1st for Lemuria Books in Jackson, Mississippi, because they're still not doing in person. And he's great. He's a visiting professor at Ole Miss, even though he lives in Washington, D.C. So had another Black author, Jeffrey Blount, who wrote The Emancipation of Evan Walsh. I may be familiar. And he and I were in conversation last Friday night for a virtual launch for this book for Novel Books in Memphis. And he's amazing. He was the first Black director at NBC News, and he's quite a professional. And if you ever want to be in conversation with another writer, he's the one. You know, it was a lot of fun. So thank you. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you very much. Is it all?
Yep.
Okay.